I'm David Halpin. I'm a retired orthopedic and trauma surgeon. I've been retired about 20 years, a bit less actually. And I have woods, which give me peace, and a lovely garden, which I look after. And I think all the time, can't stop thinking, and I'm deeply worried about our country, our NHS in particular, and my focus is especially on the Middle East and Palestine right at the middle. And as they say, if there's no peace in Palestine, there will be no peace in the Middle East. And if there's no peace in the Middle East, there will be no peace in the world. That's exactly it. That's the words of a Palestinian lady, the hospital superintendent.
Now, David, I think many people are looking at Brexit. They're focusing on specific aspects, but very few are really looking at the way that Brussels has affected the National Health Service. There is an attempt to try and homogenise all the EU members very slowly. I mean, for example, there's different VAT rates in different countries for different things, but slowly but surely they're trying to get it all as one. In what way, if at all, has the EU affected the NHS in this country?
Well, two obvious ways. One is by promoting the neoliberal ideology. It's a poor words, neoliberal. And the other obvious way is through European competition laws. Well exemplified by the way Prime Minister Major, in privatising the railways, which we, of course, invented the permanent way, they separated the wheels from the track. And, you only have to look at what's been happening throughout the privatisation of the railways, or from it, to see what a disaster that has been in terms of coordinated service, which was affordable to many. So those are the two obvious things. But I think, in fact, it's really the making capital the most important thing, and promoting the idea that private is good and public is bad. So the health service, which was conceived by, it was a thought which came. It came out of many people probably, but one was the Liberal, just forget his name for a moment, and then was Nye Bevan who set it in motion. In that first year, the budget was £3 billion. It's now 120 billion. And it was done in spite of a national debt of over 200%. And people don't know that when they're being told they can't afford it. All the middle-class people around where I'm living, in a rather nice part in the age of Dartmoor, some of them say, we cannot afford the NHS. I see red when I see that, when I think of two aircraft carriers, which are attack weapons. They're only useful in aggressive wars, not in defending our country. I see red, because that's what we're dealing with. Blind dogma and nitwits, adhering to it.
Now, David, I wonder if you look back at how the NHS came out of the Second World War.
Yes.
I mean, it really was, I think, in many people's minds, that the last thing you want to do when you're dragging someone out of a burning building is to check their documents to make sure they've got health insurance. So isn't there some sort of connection between the experience of the Blitz and the way that this idea, when it was floated in the 1945 general election by the Labour Party, that people got behind it?
Well, I think it was generally, it was a sea change, really. An officer class were not so prominent in the Second World War as they were in the First, over-the-top men. There were 3 million people to be demobbed at the end of World War II. That's a hell of a lot of people. And a lot of them came from very humble origins. They'd got together with other people. They'd seen the medical service in the Second World War working superbly without vast tiers of administrators and politicians telling them what to do, just doctors and nurses and other people doing their best for wounded soldiers. So there was, it was in fact an example of groupthink, really. They could see what was possible, and they weren't going to have the conditions which were existing before the Second World War. Like a lady I knew in Tottenham is now dead, who was a great enthusiast for Morning Star, as was I. She used to share her shoes. There were 6 in the family, very poor dwelling in North London. Father was a carpenter, and forget her name now, she was a lovely person. She shared her shoes with her sister. So one day, the sister went to school with her shoes. The next day, she went to school with the shoes. And that's the sort of thing. And she saw one of her brothers dying of meningitis in the home. So that wasn't long ago, was it, Tony? That's what, only 70 years ago?
Well, though many
So
of those people, of
knew
course, many of those people now are dead, or there's only a few left that can actually remember that experience.
And they weren't listened to, really, but you know what they used to do. Another person told me that they would have a shilling on the mantelpiece, and if there were two sick children, they'd have to work out, the parents, which was the sickest, to pay the GP. People have to think of that, and to think how now they don't have to worry. They're worrying now about waiting lists and poor service and inadequate standards as people flee the health service, the staff I mean, but they haven't had to think too much. Just to enlarge on that, there's a website in the States which looks at average costs of medicine in the States, and ordinary delivery, which they title vaginal delivery rather crudely, $12,000. The Caesar, which happens in 20% of cases of ladies in this country, of mothers, $40,000. They don't know that, and they cannot conceive it. And their minds, most of them, I'm afraid to say, are in limbo as they're distracted by the junk, the entertainment put out by the BBC.
Well, yes, but many people will point out, David, you, as a Brexiteer, are actually framing your criticism of the way that health is run in this country around the agenda of being for Brexit. So there's lots of people like Boris would probably agree with you for a change about the NHS.
You mean there's a right-wing agenda?
Well, there are many people who will see anything and pick at anything they can to say, well, we need to have a Brexit because it will help the NHS. Boris has said that.
Oh yes, I know. You mean the 38 billion which we pay to which we donate to the European Union will be redirected by Mr. Boris Johnson and the rest of the right-wingers in the Tory party, having destroyed the Labour Party by all sorts of means, but especially by the anti-Semitic slur directed at Corbyn in particular. No, I agree. That was there's an element of that, an element of truth in that. There will be some more. There will be some taxation available for public service in this country, but it depends upon the people running it. And I should add this, Tony, that I've said for about 20 years that the NHS must be disconnected from the government of the day. They come in, they always have a new idea, and we get their dogma time after time. I've seen about 8 convulsions in the health service as a surgeon, doctor, and almost all of them been harmful to the service. So there must be a national executive, very carefully chosen, not placemen, Freemasons and the rest of them, but people, executive of experts, the people of the best intent, principal people, and they report, they get a budget. The government is responsible just for inspection, say, or things like that, perhaps public health, maybe not public health, but the executive reports to the House of Commons, to the people. I know that's defective in all sorts of ways at the moment, but we must get away from the NHS being treated as a political football. Labour used it, Tories have used it, safe in our hands. Was that Cameron? That's what we're dealing with.
Is it safe in Conservative hands?
No, not at all. It's not even safe in Labour hands. During the regime, you always use the word regime about Syria and Venezuela in a pejorative way, the BBC et al. During the Blair regime, this man being a paramount psychopath and war criminal, it wasn't safe in their hands. They're also neoliberals. And they don't believe in socialized medicine, really. And in Labour time, they built surgical treatment centres, I think STCs they were called. There's one in Plymouth, around the country with public money. The one in Plymouth, now, this is very instructive. When they kicked off, they were doing hip replacement, things like that. The Italian surgeon in charge, not perhaps very long trained, I don't know, not sure about that, but he said after the first year, their infection rate for total hip replacements was 4%. Disastrous. The team, it wasn't a team of surgeons, talking to each other and having meetings. It was one from Sweden, one from Germany, one from Poland, one from Italy, that sort of thing. But you know what's happened now? Derriford, which is the largest hospital in England, I understand, talk about the satanic mills, this big chimney. They have decanted, they have diverted all orthopedic operations to this surgical treatment centre, into the care of Care UK, I think it is, one of the private companies. So there won't be any sort of corporate orthopedic feeling in Plymouth. It'll be all sort of, diverted here, there and everywhere. But they may do some operations like club foot.
Yes, but I mean, if they can do it as cheap or cheaper than the National Health Service, surely that's a good thing.
No, it isn't. It's a rotten thing. The thing is that all these things, it's not, this is one of my expressions among many, it is not quick fit tires. You need people of the highest integrity, of the best training. I qualified from St Mary's, thank God, it was a good medical school, in 1964. I didn't become a consultant in orthopedic and trauma surgery until 1975, 11 years later, at Torbay and at the Orthopedic Hospital in Exeter, which is now a housing estate. Another, I can't remember if it was Labour or Tory, it was Tory actually. They raised a first-class, single specialty hospital which could do steady work, 4 theatres, day after day after day, not on Saturdays, could have done that as well. I think it did eventually. But they raised that because now they are concentrated, the surgeons. There were 5 then. There are now 33. And in February this year, there were 33 surgeons working from 12 beds. So you can imagine how many women, they're usually women, were on the phone telling patients that they were unfortunately being put back a few months or whatever, and they'd be phoned again and the rest of it. There are legions of people now in the health service just spending time telling patients they're being postponed.
What about your? I mean, you've seen the whole process, really, haven't you? Of Britain joining the common market. We had that happened in 1973 under Ted Heath, who was a bit of a dubious prime minister, but nevertheless he signed us in with no vote or anything. And then in 1975, Harold Wilson, the Labour prime minister, allowed a referendum on the decision, and we decided that time to remain. And you've also lived through this experience in 2016. In June, where the British public voted to leave what is now the EU. Of course, we originally joined something called the Common Market, but it's transmogrified into something very much more political, where they're now talking about even a union of the armed forces, never mind Euro and the currency union. So what have you seen transformed over that period of time, and to what extent? Sorry to interrupt again, but to what extent can we actually really blame that on Brussels, and maybe it's just maladministration here too?
No, I think it's they're thinking alike. The Merkels and the Mays and people are very much alike in their so-called policies. And thinking back to when I qualified, we couldn't do so much, Tony, then, but there was a great spirit in the hospitals. There's a tremendous concentration on diagnosis, skills in that, and on surgery as well. It was a simple environment. There was a hospital governor of St Mary's and a few people in the office. That was it. I went to Torbay in 75. There was a very good manager there, administrator, I forget what his title was. It's probably secretary. There was a hospital management committee. There would be patrician Tories on that, who were as enthusiastic and as devoted to the health service as any socialist, in my view, because they knew it mattered, and it was part of the, I hate that word, community. It was part of that. It has changed, and it's become, partly it's orthopedic surgery. Orthopedic, I had a private practice, but my main job was in NHS, and I've spoken for the NHS for years and years, going back particularly to 1988, internal market of Thatcher. But when I qualified, I cannot think that money was in my mind at all. It was because I felt privileged. I just loved medicine, what I was doing, and later surgery. And that's all it was. And you'll find the same with nurses. They just like nursing. They had salaries, but they weren't magical. My salary when I first qualified as a mayor was £48 a month. It paid the rent of our flat in Chiswick. Now, I wasn't complaining about that because I loved it, and a lot of other people did as well. Now, the love bit, they've taken out of it. It's become, they have tons of protocols to follow in the ICU, this, that, and the other. I said to a consultant in ICU, who lives quite locally, no name, no pack drill, he was asking about mistakes, how do you keep things safe? And I said the most important thing is morale. Well, the morale is rock bottom, I'm told. And it's rock bottom if you know that the patient you sent for is being cancelled. And if you can't do the operation which you were gearing up to do because it was difficult. So things have changed dramatically. And what I would say, there's been the principle and our spirit, it's the spirit that's been eroded. And there's a very good quotation from a book by a fellow of Jewish origin. His family were Berlin Jews. They got out in 1936 to America. He was a journalist, but he wrote a good book called 1938 to 45. The Germans, they thought they were free. And there's some quotations from that book. I never read the book, actually, to be honest about it. But the quotations are absolutely apt. When I say to people, I say, this is Britain now. Things change surreptitiously. You don't see it. Like he says in these quotations, the farmer doesn't see the wheat growing. You don't see it. But it's happened. And what has happened is a spirit, the spirit of collegiality. There are influences like that. Look at online marketing as a good example. Things like that. But you think of the European Union, it isn't about the good and about people being able to express themselves and do their best for their neighbours and for their country. It's about war. The EU is the soft side of NATO, with the US over the waters driving it. So NATO backed the decimation of Yugoslavia. It keeps quiet on the torture, the crucifixion of the Palestinian people. It makes a few gestures, it sends a few things out, water tanks or whatever, but doesn't do anything practical about it, solid about it. And it's the same with Iraq. The coalition of the 39, wasn't it? I think, when they started bombing Iraq and destroying that country and many of its people. Libya, Syria, the same. So it's not a good setup.
Well, some people will say the opposite. They'll say, well, some of the main countries like France and Germany and Italy have actually pushed back against NATO and against the Americans.
Rubbish.
And the British, no?
Rubbish. There's no pushback at all. Well, look at Venezuela. I sent a piece to the Inflation Clearinghouse. It's about the BBC, the most potent state propagandist, and they published it. So what? So they should. Michel Chossudovsky, the chief editor, put it up. Venezuela, who is in fact backing Guaido, who they say is a CIA creature, wouldn't be surprised. They've had sanctions there from America. Sanctions, in fact, are an act of war, as they are against Iran, and the sanctions U.S. sanctions have been going there since 2015.
Let me quickly ask you about the whole David Kelly business, because there's just been another book out on that, hasn't there? And I know you had something to do with you were one of the people who was protesting, really, about him almost certainly not having committed suicide. Can you just tell us in a nutshell what's the latest on that?
There's no latest, really. There are some extra facts which Miles Goldsworth has elicited, and which is in his paperback version. The title is The Inconvenient Death of Dr. Kelly, then there's a colon, and I forget the rest. But that's the first part of the title. And it's a good book, good books, the paperback and the previous one, the hardback. But I'm afraid that certain things are omitted, which are very important indeed, which suggested to my mind that Kelly was like, we want a loose cannon, but he was about to spill the beans. And he was spilling the beans, this is very important, when in May 2003, when they'd found no weapons of mass destruction, Blair's pretext for the war, and the public were against the war anyway, in a majority, I believe, and things were sinking. It was getting more unpopular as the war went on in those first 2 months. And Kelly made some observations, which are on Global Research, written by me, the evidence of his daughter Rachel. And it's very important evidence. It suggests that he was speaking his mind. And they don't want people speaking their mind, because it would have shown that the whole thing was a sham, and a terrible sham for the poor people of Iraq, who'd been shredded and killed, and the water supplies and all the rest destroyed.
Now, David, if you got whereabouts is the best place to read your articles and follow your work?
Well, my website is, if you Google the website of David Halpin, that's one thing, it's Halpin. And also on Global Research, there's about 35 papers of mine, essays or pieces, articles. But there's a lot on Kelly on Global Research, and it is very, very important stuff. If anyone can conclude that he was, from that, conclude he committed suicide, they'd be pushing it. Don't forget that Kelly has had no inquest. He is unique in having had an unnatural death, died unnaturally, and not having inquest. And that's why we battled on, why I went to the High Court in 2011, December the 19th, to ask permission for a judicial review of Grieve, who in opposition said we had a good case. When he came into power as Attorney General, he in fact refused, it was in his power to direct that an inquest be held.
And would you just like to remind us how long the papers are apparently sealed for?
70 years. The lifetime of his 3 daughters. That's the thing. And a lot of it is sealed. Most of the avenues were blocked that we inquired into, including the police. Not all, but there's about 3 key things. The body was moved. You don't move bodies when you find them dead. The Hutton inquiry was set up by Blair from his jet traveling towards Tokyo from Washington within an hour of the corpse being found and before it was identified. Falconer called Hutton to his office to set up an ad hoc inquiry which had no powers of inquiry. No oath, no subpoena of witnesses, no ability to call a jury, and it's something else I'd just forgotten actually, but it was guaranteed. It was an ad hoc inquiry, and they added section 17 on top of it.
So do you want to just pause for a second and see if you can remember what the last one was?
No cross-examination. So I'm 78 now, Tony. No cross-examination. So Hunt, the pathologist, who was only 2 years on the Home Office list as a pathologist, he was called to the business. I wouldn't, if I was in charge of it, he was a reasonable chap, perhaps, but he was only 2 years on the list. He was 9 years qualified. I'd been doing 9 years of my surgical training before I became, we'll leave that actually, but that's, the whole thing stinks. And one little point I could make now is that Kelly was very keen on having a cell phone with him. In his house, he had 7 encrypted hard drives. He knew everything that was happening in Iraq, and he wanted to know what was going on. He was probably wanting to know about WMDs, which were non-existent, they found. But he had 7 encrypted hard drives. He used the cell phone a lot, I think. He went out for a walk at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a Thursday, and no one saw him alive after that. In fact, he was seen alive by a farmer, but he withdrew the evidence. And a search party went out from his village to Southall. They never got called. But he had a cell phone with him, and you know very well that a cell phone emits a signal. Quite often, actually. I think it's probably every minute, I think. And Oxfordshire is bristling with antennae. You can imagine, can't you? And you can imagine that they would be able to triangulate his position accurately. They could have proved suicide simply by saying Dr. Kelly left his house at 3 o'clock. He got to Harrowdown Hill at, say, an hour later, and he sat there contemplating suicide for the next 12 hours or something like that. But they shared nothing about his movements from the cell phone. The other thing is, he left the house at 3 o'clock. There was a maelstrom around him, a storm around him, and his family, the daughters were called. They did not inform the police that he was missing, even though he was much at risk, until 11:15 that day. 3 o'clock to 11:15. You can imagine what was going on, can't you? It's extraordinary.
That was South Dartmoor-based retired trauma surgeon David Halpin. And the book about the death of David Kelly, just out, is by Miles Gosling, Goslet, and it's entitled An Inconvenient Death: How the Establishment Covered Up the David Kelly Affair. Priced around about £7.
You're listening to dialectradio.co.uk, your local community radio run by volunteers. Log on to our website at dialectradio.co.uk to find out more.